A very warm welcome to this lockdown LitFest event, where I am delighted to introduce Kate Mosse, the author of 9 novels and short story collections, including, of course, the #1 multi-million selling Languedoc Trilogy, which includes Labyrinth, Sepulchre and Citadel, and the #1 best-selling Gothic fiction, including The Winter Ghost and The Taxidermist's Daughter, which she is currently adapting for the stage. Her books have been translated into no fewer than 38 languages and published in more than 40 countries. She's also written 3 works of non-fiction, 4 plays, contributed essays and introductions to classic novels and collections. Kate Mosse, a very warm welcome to the Lockdown LitFest stage.
Thank you, Paul.
It's such a pleasure to see you. I am in lockdown in my father's house in the middle of rural Warwickshire. Whereabouts are we speaking to you from?
I'm at home in Chichester in Sussex, and it's been the most amazing experience in a way to be here at this time of year during lockdown, as the whole garden and everything has come into bloom. So there are definite benefits to being locked down: more writing and more admiring of nature.
Well, you know, that seems to be a current theme. I had a conversation with Joanna Harris recently. She and I have been having a sort of Twitter competition of hashtag outside today or today outside. And I've been showing the grape hyacinths and the snowdrops and the bluebells in my dad's
apple tree, the blossom, you know, all, yeah, it's wonderful. I mean, I think that's something, I think a lot of the time we're all telling ourselves about good things and trying to be positive. And there's no doubt that if all of this had happened in November and December, that would have been, you know, probably a lot harder than it is looking out the window at a blue sky.
Absolutely so. Yes, let's be grateful for small mercies,
Yes.
the weather not least amongst them. There's lots of things I would like to talk to you about because you've been so prolific and wide-ranging in your own writing, but also as a champion for women's creativity, which we'll come to because I know this of all weeks is an important one for you. But if I may, can we do a little voyage around you and your own writing?
Yes.
With a very rather 101 interviewer's question, but your background as a child, when the young Kate Mosse was growing up, was it a family of books, a family of reading, a house of books?
It was, I grew up about a mile from where I'm standing now, in a village called Fishbourne, which is where one of my novels, The Taxidermist's Daughter, is set. And it was absolutely one of those childhoods in the 60s and 70s of sitting down at the table every night at 6 o'clock when my father came back from the office, and having supper together, my ma and my pa and my 2 younger sisters. And there absolutely were books about. My father was a massive supporter of the Reader's Digest. So we would get those books, all, you know, they all looked exactly the same with sort of green leather and gold trim and all of that sort of stuff. But also lots of childhood books. And my sisters both lived very close by too. We all went away and came back. And so we still have most of our childhood books. We've divided them up. So my middle sister loved Anton B. I liked Little Grey Rabbit. And my granny, her childhood friend was Beatrix Potter, in the Lake District. And every year when they went up to the Lake District to stay, she and Beatrix would talk and discuss and all of these things. My granny was a Beatrice. And so I also have, and they were read to me, original Beatrix Potter books that were given by her to my granny. So we had lots of reading and lots of reading out loud. And of course we had no idea how lucky we were to have that.
What a wonderful background to have. I mean, I can't remember quite when Beatrix Potter died, so forgive me if this is a personal question. Did you ever meet her?
Oh, no, I did not, sadly. No, but my granny, that particular granny died, you know, all the women in both sides of the family are very long living. Right. But that granny died in the late 70s. And, you know, she married in 1916. So this was the turn of the last century that she, Beatrix Potter. But some of the books I've got are from 1909, the old Frederick Vaughan. And of course, it was only much later that we realized they really shouldn't be lying about, you know, for the cat to fall over. Put them on a shelf at least. But yeah, so and I still love those books, still love them.
Oh, well, why wouldn't you? Of course, we all still do. If memory serves, your first foray into publication was a non-fiction work, Becoming a Mother, but your first fiction work was Eskimo Kissing.
It was.
What I want to tease apart is that transition in a writer's life when you've consumed stories, loved stories, and admired them, and realised that they spring from somewhere and that you can do it too. Can you talk us through that?
Well, I think the thing for me was that if I'd been able to put anything on my passport when I was growing up, I would have put reader. And you're the same, Blez. Yeah. I mean, I know that. And of course, I didn't know what you could do to be a reader professionally, but my image was, of course, lying around in, a beautiful long white lace dress with a hand trailing on the grass or something. And I would just read all the time, and people would pay me for doing this. I didn't quite understand. There was a little bit more to it than that. So when I left university, I became a publisher and had a fantastic time working in publishing. But then was leaving to do two things: the Women's Prize for Fiction that we'll talk about, and also I was expecting my second child. And I had one of those moments with sitting with an agent friend of mine called Mark Lucas, who's still my agent, nearly 30 years on now. And I was just complaining, actually, that the book I wanted to read while I was pregnant first time around wasn't there. And now I was pregnant again and it still wasn't around. And Mark just challenged me. He just said, well, stop moaning and write it. Oh. And I said, well, okay, I will, and that sort of, charging off. And he rang up the next day and said, I've got you a contract. I went, what? So he really did propel me into writing. And because of that book and the Royal Opera House book I wrote, an editor from a fiction part of the list got in touch and said, I know they're non-fiction books, but actually what you're doing is telling stories of real people. What about imaginary people? So again, I was kind of propelled into looking for a story. And I wrote Eskimo Kissing and then another novel called Crucifix Lane. And I think, it's a lovely thing. Now I've been very lucky in how things have gone. So people say, oh, they must have been literary novels. The truth was they weren't very good and they just didn't sell. So that was it. And I hadn't found my voice. And I was always sitting on my own shoulder, kind of judging it. I was editing before I'd written, really. And then the thing that transformed everything for me was we had bought a tiny little house in Languedoc in a place called Carcassonne in 1989. And we went there for the first time that November, and I got off the train. I was expecting my daughter at that stage. And we walked through the town, and Blez, and many of the people watching will know this, that the thing that happens in French towns out of season, which is at 1 minute past 7, everyone vanishes. There's nobody about. And we walked through this deserted town, and it was misty and it was quiet. And every now and again, you'd hear a kind of clopping of footsteps and heels somewhere in the mist. And then we got to the Pont Vieux, which divides the modern town, the Bastide, 14th century, from the medieval citadel, La Cité, up on the hill. And I saw this incredible fairy tale world for the first time, 2 rings of walls, 52 towers and turrets. And it was just a coup de foudre. I just fell in love. And I didn't intend to write about it, but I read everything all the time. I dusted off my poor schoolgirl French and started to read about a group of Christians, the Cathars, who had lived and died in that part of France. I started to read about the landscape and the topography. And over the next few years, we were just there 4 or 5 months a year, having one child and then another child, and we were very flexible and had no real jobs. And little by little, what I always talk about now is the whispering in the landscape. I started to realize that there were characters waiting in the wings, and that actually I had a story I wanted to tell. And so, if you like, the reason I became a novelist as opposed to a writer who has written some novels and some non-fiction was that I went to Carcassonne. So Carcassonne made me a writer, no doubt.
That is so eloquently and beautifully put. And I know exactly of what you speak. I mean, 20 years ago, as you know, I wrote a non-fiction book based with the sort of mystery of Rennes-le-Château, not so far away from you. But there is something peculiar about that landscape that it sort of has stories woven into the very fabric of the geography of the place.
Exactly.
It's an extraordinary thing. So the question I want to ask you is, how much does that sense of place give you as a writer that allows you to populate it with the characters of your own imagining?
Everything. It's exactly the right question, Blez. It's this. It won't surprise many of my readers to hear me say it, that the novel that I would say from the burning house would be Wuthering Heights. I read it first when I was a teenager. I've read it every decade of my life, and it's a different novel every time. So it's a novel about race and class. It's a novel about domestic violence. It's a novel about obsession. It's a novel about the indifference of nature to the human condition. The one thing it isn't is a love story, obviously. It's a good story. But key in it, I suppose, is that the main character of Wuthering Heights is the land. It is the Yorkshire moors. And I think that always has been inside of me, that until I know the place, there's no story. I'm not one that would read something in the newspaper and think, oh, that's an interesting theme, I'll go and talk about that. Or even read about a character and think, oh, I want to write about them. Place and character are indistinguishable for me. And for that part of France, and indeed my part of Sussex, where there's a great deal of folklore and sort of not mysticism quite, but the idea that the land itself holds the truth, that, you know, history is all very well, but actually you find the truth of history in the land, in the trees that have stood there for 1,000 years, and all of these sorts of things. And that is it's like building a stage set. Once I've got the stage set, then of course the players can come. But until the stage set's there's nothing for them to work against. So Carcassonne for me has, well, it's given me everything as a writer. And it's a very strange thing. I know you've been talking to Ian Rankin, and we talked about this once, that he had to be away from Edinburgh to be able to write about Edinburgh.
Right.
All of those things. For me, Carcassonne is the place that I became a novelist, and it's all of my historical fiction are love letters to Carcassonne. But actually, it taught me how to be a novelist at home in Sussex too. And that's why I didn't start writing stories set here until much later on, because I needed to go away in order to be able to see my home as opposed to my adopted home clearly.
Yeah, no, that's very wonderfully put, and it puts me in mind of so many phrases I've heard from other writers, you know, across the 20 years that I've been writing and talking to other writers, is that it's impossible to write something where you are one of the trees in the wood. You need to step outside the wood in order to see the scope of the wood and have the objectivity to write about it, which I think you just explained beautifully. Okay, so Labyrinth became a huge success, and it was such a joy knowing you as I have got to know you, seeing you find that beautiful voice. But the huge success of it, when you then have a publisher saying, oh my God, it's a multi-million runaway, we want more of the same. In your writerly head, nobody wants to write the same book twice. Yeah. How did you deal with I'm not saying follow-up, but the next book, which was Sepulchre? I would guess there was a lot of pressure on your shoulders at that point.
I think one has to be really, really careful because it is the most glorious and unexpected luck if you have a hit like I was lucky enough to have with Labyrinth. And you're right, Blez, you were there. I think you were almost, possibly even the first interview I did for Labyrinth back in the day, back in 2005, when it wasn't even quite out. It was like the week before. And you know that the idea that this was going to be a huge hit had really not crossed my mind. I was just hoping that people other than my mum was going to read it. You know, that's where I was at that stage. So the thing that I really, when I look back, I think, you know, it's a wonderful problem to have. That's the first thing. The second thing is that I was very lucky to have, because I've been a publisher and because of the Women's Prize and because of doing a lot of broadcasting, I had a lot of friends who were novelists. So I had people that I could talk to, you know, sort of Joanna Trollope, Joanne Harris, Tracy Chevalier, Jojo Moyes, Ian Rankin, Anthony Horowitz, you know, people who I knew professionally, as it were, who were brilliant and generous with advice. The thing that I did wrong, I would say, is that I allowed myself to be hurried. I should have just been brave enough to say the book will be finished when the book is finished. But I really very much did want to get another book out and all of those things, and they wanted one, and there was a lot of pressure to do it quickly. And looking back, I think that's the only thing that I wish I'd taken a little more time and just not allowed myself to be on a treadmill quite so soon. I then subsequently, of course, after a while, had to step out from writing full time anyway, because I've been a carer for the past 12 years, and that made a difference to what I could do in my time. And that actually was an oddly wonderful gift, because it made me really fall back in love with writing again and feel outside of the pressure to deliver to a schedule that might not be good for the book. Because in the end, readers want the best book you can write, not the one that you could get out on Thursday rather than Sunday. And so that's something that I have learned, and I always try, when new writers ask, is to pass on that advice as well. You know, the book is done when the book is done. I mean, you should follow your deadlines, but the point is, agree to a sensible deadline. Don't let your publishers down, but don't agree to something that you don't think you're going to be able to do.
You put me in mind of the wonderful Douglas Adams quote about him loving the whoosh of deadlines passing by.
Yeah, exactly.
Writing away.
I mean, that's the nightmare for all of us in lockdown at the moment. Not a single writer who's in contract will have an excuse for being late. Not a single one.
I'm going to make one point. I think you're doing Sepulchre a disservice, and I know that I'm a fan of yours, and I'm an unabashed and unashamed fan, because I love your writing. But there's a thing I think you might have missed with Sepulchre, which is that although it's written in haste, it is a beautiful novel. It is an extraordinary story.
Yeah, I love Sepulchre. I'm very fond of it, and it's a very interesting thing. I realise that when people come up at readings, and people are lovely, and they often bring their old books to be signed as well as the current one, as it were, and that's fine, and that's a wonderful it's a privilege. But when people say, I love all your books, but Sepulchre's my favourite, I always like those people just a little bit more than anybody else, because I love Sepulchre as well, but it always feels like the slightly awkward middle child. This
is the point that I was going to make, because it does something rather crucial for what we now understand as the Languedoc Trilogy. It sets up Citadel, and it leaves you at the end of Sepulchre. You know you're wanting more. Did you know Citadel was good? Did you have an idea that it was going to be a trilogy when you wrote the end of Sepulchre?
No, not Labyrinth, actually. We call them the Languedoc Trilogy just because, of course, it's ease of access and making it clear to readers that they can read them in that order. But truthfully, the reason I'm having such a great time at the moment is that I'm writing for the first time ever a series that I have planned as a series. With Labyrinth, I just was writing Labyrinth, and then when it was over, I thought, I'm not done with Carcassonne, and I'm not done with the landscape. And when I started writing Sepulchre, I wasn't expecting Udrit Bayard to be in it. And I suddenly thought, what I need now is a wise old man. Oh, I've got one of those. So let's get him in from Labyrinth. And then, of course, when I was writing Sepulchre, I thought, actually, I could finish this off. And the reason that I wanted to write Citadel is that the history of the Second World War is live on every street sign in the Bastide of Carcassonne. And I started to notice that the date of death for all the resistants who have got streets named after them in the centre was the same. And that is very unusual. Obviously, you often see people commemorated in signs in France particularly, but the date of death isn't normally the same. And so I started to think, what happened that the whole Carcassonne resistance was murdered on the same day? That's really unusual. And so for me, most of my writing in that way is curiosity. I wonder what happened. What happened on the 19th of August, 1944, for it to be on every street corner in the Bastide? And out of that came the investigation of the story. And out of that, of course, came Bayard and another character, a young character who was in Sepulchre, who is now an older woman in Citadel. And that has been a joy. But it did set up in me the desire to properly plan and prosecute, if you like, a series of books, so that I wasn't always playing catch up with myself, if you like, that I knew the end before I started the beginning. And that's why the Burning Chamber series is such a joy.
That's incredibly well put. Can we talk a little bit about the Gothic fiction? Because I'm very interested to know where books like Winter Ghost, Taxidermist's Daughter, which wellspring they come from in your mind, and how you sort of partition those different sort of narrative strands in your own head.
Well, they don't come from a different place, actually. It's more that, as we were talking about earlier, about the importance to me of land and place, is when I needed to adjust my working life in order to be a carer, to be much more at home in Sussex. And my wonderful parents, my mother and father, lived here with us as well. They're both gone now, sadly, but the legendary Granny Rosie, my mother-in-law, who's actually lived with us for 20 years, is still going strong, and she's still here, and I care for her now. It meant that I couldn't travel as much. I could nip across to Carcassonne or nip, on a bit of a book tour, but I couldn't just be away. It wasn't possible, as anybody who's listening who cares for older people know, particularly if they live with you. So it's a daily thing. So actually, it was more about finding a story and stories within the landscape I knew and loved. So although The Winter Ghost is set partly in Tarascon, in near, in the Ariège, right down towards Andorra, I had many pictures. I've been there many times. Its inspiration comes from Sussex. The lead character Freddie comes from a Sussex family, because all of the men of the Royal Sussex Regiment pretty much were wiped out on one day before the Battle of the Somme, in fact. And so when you walk here locally, again, it's that thing of seeing the names, brother after cousin after son after father, all lost on the same day, the Battle of the Boar's Head. And so that I'd always had in my mind. And then with the Taxidermist daughter, it's exactly the same. I grew up in Fishbourne. I was obsessed with the Taxidermy Museum of Walter Potter that we used to visit all the time. In those days, you took your packed lunch as a school trip and sat amongst the taxidermy on the floor. There was no such thing as health and safety in the 70s and 60s. And it was terrific. And I'd always wanted, I've always been fascinated with taxidermy. And that period, that sort of late fin de siècle, the last summer of England before the First World War. And so being more at home meant that the landscape of home was more live in my mind. And I love Gothic fiction, and I like that sort of old-fashioned Gothic horror. I like the subtlety of it and the cleverness of it. It's often presented and it looks like it's all, Boris Karloff and everybody doing this kind of thing, all the rest of it. But actually, the real Gothic novels, from the Castle of Otranto, the Mysteries of Udolpho, Frankenstein, these great works. I'd always wanted to write in that genre, and we'll do some more writing in that genre. But it's the practicalities of a writer's life. If your inspiration comes from trudging around the mountains of southwest France and you can't be there, you have two choices, don't you? Either not to write at all, or you immerse yourself in a different landscape that will give you that nourishment to find your story.
Quite. Forgive me if this is ill-advised, but you mentioned Granny Rosie. She's becoming a bit of a celebrity. For those who aren't aware and who don't yet follow you on your Twitter feed, which I trust they will, it's I can't remember, is it at Kate Mosse?
Yes, that's all.
Tell us a little bit about Granny Rosie and what's happening.
Granny Rosie is a total legend. I mean, she is a local legend anyway. She's my mother-in-law, but everybody calls her Granny Rosie. And she's been in the local paper quite a lot because she knits amazing little tableaus in wool for the Chestnut Tree Hospice Shop, which is for children with life-limiting and terminal illness. And she's raised thousands of pounds for them by doing this, and they're on display in the window. And then she won from the whole of the local newspaper group in the Best of Sussex Awards in December. She won the Local Hero Award, and it was fantastic. But everybody, I think, at the moment is so grateful to the frontline healthcare workers and all the workers, the key workers who are going out and keeping things going and looking after us while we're all, sitting at home. And Granny decided last week that she'd like to do something, quite inspired by Captain Tom, of course. The older man he is, obviously, because she's nearly 90, but he's nearly 100. So there was this. And so we took electric piano out into the street, and Granny decided she'd just play some music for people. And I told all the neighbours this was going to happen, and everybody observed social distancing, but about 80 people came out from different parts and stopped. And Granny Rosie finished off with "We'll Meet Again." And people started to sing, and a couple of old couples were dancing. And it was incredibly moving. And that was that. And our children were here, and my daughter was filming it, and my son was carrying the keyboard, and my husband got all the electrics, and I was pushing a wheelchair. And it was just one of those moments. But the next day, my phone did not stop ringing. So first of all, the local paper, then the local radio station, then the Victoria Derbyshire show rang. Granny Rosie played live on Tuesday, and then she went on this morning with Phil and Holly yesterday, playing Roll Out the Barrel and We'll Meet Again. And we're supporting a local charity that was set up by local people who went to the same school as my children, and they're frontline doctors, and all the money goes straight to frontline health workers rather than going to a big pot. And so Granny Rosie just, has become a star, and quite right. She is amazing, and I think it's what everybody needs, just somebody sitting in the street singing some songs and you hearing everybody else joining in, because we're all separated. Many people around here are on their own, and to be able to just sing with people, even if you're not standing right next to them, that is an amazing form of connection, joining in song together. So, I'm now managing her diary, obviously. I'll never write another book.
Agent for Granny Rosie.
Absolutely.
If anybody wants to get on board and to donate, where should they head for?
The charity we're supporting is called Heroes, and it's help us to help them.com.
Help us to help them.com.
Yeah.
Please head there and support Granny Rosie, who is going to be the next star. And then maybe one day, who knows, we'll put them together, put Granny Rosie together with Captain Tom Moore, and we'll have the dynamic duo leading from the front. Kate, you've had a hell of a busy week, not least with Granny Rosie, it turns out, but also as in your role as founder director of the Women's Prize for Fiction, which, unless I'm mistaken, and I may be, celebrates, is it its 25th anniversary this year?
It is. I mean, that seems unbelievable. And, when I look back to kind of trying to make phone calls from a little back bedroom in a terraced house in, southeast London, trying to get through, was there anybody who would talk to me about maybe giving money for a literary prize, all of these sorts of things. It seems extraordinary that it's 25 years, but everybody who's been involved in it, and that's hundreds and thousands of people, has played their part, and it's wonderful. And this week on Tuesday, obviously because of the lockdown, we had to do it differently. So we did a virtual announcement of our 2020 shortlist, and it's a fantastic list. And we've got a brilliant panel of judges chaired by Baroness Martha Lane Fox. And of course, like everybody else, we're delaying our big event, our big public event, until September, hoping that by the 9th of September, when we will announce the 25th winner, at least there will be small gatherings allowed. It might just be me and the chair of judges and the winner, I suppose, handing it over. But it's been a wonderful thing. And we're running, as part of that, a campaign called Reading Women, just follow the hashtag Reading Women. And that has been wonderful, because we're looking back on the previous 24 winners. And of course, many of the people who are picking up those books were not born when Helen Dunmore won the very first Women's Prize for Fiction. And of course, great books, our aim was always to put the classics of tomorrow in the hands of the readers of today. And so oddly, within the lockdown, people are thinking about books and reading such a lot. So, I'm very much hoping that people will have time to read every book on the shortlist, which they might not otherwise do in very busy work lives and domestic lives and with all the responsibilities. So it's a great year, and it does feel a wonderful moment to be raising a glass to all of the shortlisted and long-listed authors from the past, and all the winners and all the judges and every single person, you included, Blez, who have over the years played their part by supporting the prize, by getting word out about the prize, until it's grown to be the biggest annual celebration of women's writing anywhere in the world.
Well, I played no role at all. All I had was a little radio station at the time, was able to beam it to a few million people.
Exactly.
Conversation.
It was very, very much appreciated. People forget, you see, once something is so successful as the prize is now, and is so much part of the literary ecology and the landscape, and everybody understands it as part of the business of books, people forget that when you start anything new, not everybody welcomes it. Things start slowly, and people's attitudes change, and all of this sort of stuff. So for me, when I look back, and I look back at those people who from the very first day said, this is great, this is promoting exceptional writing, let's get that word out there. Everybody does it now. But right at the beginning, you remember who those people were.
Exactly. Well, I'm just going to say, we are delighted to have you, our audience. We are in our very beginning stages, and it is grâce à people like Kate who answered my unusual call to arms with two very quick questions. What do you want and when do you want it? Without people like Kate and Ian and Joanne and all the people you've seen so far appear on the show, we wouldn't be here, as well as the team that are putting it. And it's because of you, the audience, that we're trying to do this. And we hope one day to be as informative and as entertaining and as influential as the Women's Prize for Fiction. I'm just going to say, what a hell of a shortlist. Angie Cruz, Bernadine Evaristo, Natalie Haynes, Hilary Mantel, Maggie O'Farrell, and Jenny O'Phil. If you were going to read 6 books over the next couple of months, what a great library to have.
I know. And they're so diverse. Their voices, what they're writing about, their attitudes, their backgrounds, their own experiences and stories, really diverse list. And it's one of those things that it's a joy for me, because I can say, look, try these 6 books and know that if somebody doesn't particularly take to one, they will find another one that they love. And that's one of the things that is such a hallmark of this wonderful judging panel, is that they have managed to choose a really fabulous representative group of books that say this is exceptional writing by women from all over the world at this moment in time. And they're all books that will endure in different ways. So yes, it's a thrilling list. And we're very proud of it. And there'll be a lot of things going on our podcast. Obviously, as I said, the Reading Women campaign. There'll be a lot of conversation about these books and with the authors over the next few months, of course. And then, the 9th of September will be crowned the 25th winner. So.
Wow. And you couldn't have put it better yourself. These are 6 classics of the future. We don't have much time. There are 2 things I do want to talk to you about, Kate. And we're back to your historical fiction. The City of Tears, which is now due out early next year, I understand. Is that correct?
Yes, it was due to be published in May, but like many publishers, my publisher made the decision to postpone properly, as it were, not just let it go a little bit later, to January 2021, partly because I do a lot of live events. I love to actually meet my readers in person. And that's a huge part of my joy of publishing, the physical copies and being out there. And so we felt it would be better to delay until we were more confident that we'd be able to be out and about. What is wonderful about that is that all of my publishers all over the world are delaying, which means for the first time, I'll actually have a global publication date in January. I've never had that before. And the City of Tears is the second in my Burning Chambers series, which, it was my return to historical fiction. And I was so thrilled and so touched that readers loved it and took it to their hearts as much as they did. And of course, now, because I'm not out promoting and getting ready to promote the City of Tears, I'm already at work on number 3 of the series. There's 4.
Hold on. Before you come to number 3, Kate Mosse, for those that haven't yet discovered the joy of these 2 books, or for the first one, can you give us the setup for Burning Chambers? Because, ladies and gentlemen, there'll be a buy the book button appearing beneath this very screen, which will take you straight to buy the Burning Chambers. And boy, do I commend it to you. But Kate, tell us what you set out to write when you wrote the Burning Chambers.
The Burning Chambers is it's a series of books inspired by the Huguenot diaspora, the French Wars of Religion, that started in 1562 in France. And it's, of course, part of the bigger Reformation story. But it's a series of books that will cover 300 years. It will travel the world. The prologue of the Burning Chambers is in Franschhoek in South Africa, which is where the number 4 is set. And it is the story of 2 families. It's a Romeo and Juliet story, a Catholic family, a Huguenot family, and a feud that lasts 300 years. There's, of course, a missing relic. There's a missing will. There are inheritance stories. There's forbidden love. There is a sense of what it would be like to be caught up in the big moments of history. And of course, when I started to write The Burning Chambers, which introduces the Joubert family and my lead character Minou and her love, Pete, and their family and the generations that go on, I don't think I could have imagined any more than anybody else that we would suddenly be living through real history as it happened. That is what is so extraordinary about the times that we're in. We know that in the future, people will study this time and it will be something learnt in schools. normally you're just living. But for me, what I wanted to do was look at the great moments of war and the consequences of war, love and the consequences of war, love, fear and the consequences of fear. And at the beginning of the Wars of Religion, what it was like to be a normal family in Carcassonne in 1562, living your life. They're Catholic, but their neighbors are Protestant, they're Jewish, they're Muslim, and nobody defines themselves like that. But hundreds of miles away, a massacre is about to happen that will set France against itself. It will be a generation of terrible civil war, and it will leave millions of people murdered, tortured, executed, and particularly as refugees. And so the burning chambers is in Carcassonne, Toulouse, and Puivert down in the Pyrenean Mountains. The City of Tears, which will come out in January, follows on from that. Minou and Pete's story and the feud between this other family. And it is in Paris for the most notorious engagement of the French Wars of Religion, which is, of course, the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre in August 1572, when almost the entire Huguenot leadership is wiped out. And the bulk of the novel is set in Amsterdam, the great refugee city of the 16th and 17th century, where many Huguenot refugees fled. But the inspiration overall for the series did come from standing in the graveyard in Franschhoek in South Africa. And I was there for a literary festival. And as I arrived in the town for the first time, I noticed that all the names on restaurants and the wineries were French. La Grande Provence, Petite France, all of these things. And I didn't know anything about this bit of history. And then the main street is called Huguenot Street. And so I smelt a rat and I said to the lovely person driving me, I didn't know there seems to be a strong French influence. And he said, oh, don't you know that Franschhoek means in Afrikaans the French corner?
French corner.
And you know all of this, Blez, of course, because this is not so far from some of your story. So I ran to the end of the road. I went to the Huguenot Museum and discovered two things that were just mind-blowing for a novelist, that moment where you feel like the finger running down your back and it makes you shiver. And it was this. Firstly, that the South African wine industry, not completely, but in a huge amount, was started by a small handful of Huguenot refugees. That was the first thing. And it was like, this is amazing piece of information. And discovered that what had happened is that the governor of the Cape at the time, who was Dutch, part of the Dutch East India Company, obviously who had invaded and stolen the land from the African people who it belonged to, he realized that the land in the Cape, of course, this is the wine lands around Stellenbosch, the Cape of Good Hope, was very similar to the land in Languedoc, southwest France. And then thought, well, if we plant vines and make wine, then we won't have to ship our wine from Europe to our colonies, as of course they called them, out in the Far East. So he sent back a message to Amsterdam, to his masters at the Dutch East India Company, and said, if there are any Huguenot refugees in Amsterdam who are winemakers from the southwest of France, who would be prepared to come to the Cape, we will pay for your passage on a ship. We will pay for your family to go with you. We will give you land and money to plant vines when you get there. And we will send a French pastor to administer to your spiritual needs. And 7 families sailed. And that was, just the most amazing history. And I went out and, to the room at the back, and I looked at the names, all these names of the people that sailed on the various ships. And there on the list, I found a family name of a family that I had used in Labyrinth.
No.
At that moment, I thought, oh my God. Oh, then I thought, no, don't do this, Moose. You know nothing about the 17th and 18th century. You know nothing about the sea. You know nothing about South Africa, and it's a minefield. The Reformation has never been your period, but it just wouldn't leave me alone. And then I went outside in the graveyard in Franschhoek, and I walked amongst the graves and saw all of the names, the French names, the de Villiers family, the Joubert family, the Jourdain family, the Dutoit. But then I looked up and I saw the ring of mountains around Franschhoek. And I thought, what would it feel like to be a woman standing in this graveyard in 1862 because you've come in search of your family history and this feud that has been going for 300 years. And you've never been there, but you've grown up hearing from your mother, and your grandmother and her great-grandmother, going back 300 years, of the place called Languedoc that your family was forced to flee as refugees. But what if you came here and then you looked up at the Franschhoek Mountains and they look like the mountains of home?
Right.
And at that moment I thought, all refugee stories are stories of injustice and great grief and sadness. And of course, the word nostalgia is like the longing for home, that sort of sense. But I thought, but also you could find yourself as a refugee on the other side of the world and feel, no, this could be home too. And at that moment I thought, oh God, I'm committed. So, that was it. So that was where the series came from. And so book 3 that I'm just starting to work on is the voyage from Amsterdam to the Canary Islands, which was one of the great wine producing areas in the 17th century, and then on to the Cape of Good Hope, and they will finally hit landfall in Table Bay in 1688.
Not that I need to say anything, but I'm going to say this. In case you haven't guessed, here's an analogy for how Kate writes. She writes like Monet painted.
Ah.
Huge canvases, brilliant fine detail. And the book she's just been talking about, it's just like a Nymphaeus, exquisite detail set in a huge historical canvas. Kate, we've taken far too much of your time. Before we go, may I ask one last thing of you?
Of course.
You're at home with your husband, you're locked down with your husband and your kids, and you're caring. Do you have any words of support or comfort for people that find themselves in a similar situation who are finding this all rather difficult?
I think for many people, being on their own and genuinely on their own, for all the wonders of technology, is incredibly difficult. And for other people, being, who are trying to homeschool children and keep their jobs going, don't know if they're going to have jobs going back. I think everybody, this is an unprecedented situation, as the politicians keep telling us. I think the most important thing is, insofar as it's possible, to be kind to yourself. I think that it's lovely. People saying, at last, I'm going to do yoga every day, or I'm going to run 6,000 miles every day, or I'm going to learn to bake, or this is great, of course, if that's what you want to do. But also just living, getting through the day, that's okay too. A day that is spent being with people or speaking to people on the phone, or if you're able and are free to do it, volunteering and going and buying shopping for other people, or getting medicines for older people who can't get out. Just living is enough at the moment. And because we're all going to need all our energy to rebuild things when this is over. So I think it's that. And I think there, a lot of people feel under pressure to make every second count, which, I'm a culprit of that. I think, God, I haven't written anything today. And then I thought, I can't write at the moment. Not really. I can't concentrate. And once I accepted that, of course, I have been able to think much more, but so don't put yourselves under pressure. And I think all of that stuff, if you are on your own and don't feel shy at ringing up a neighbor, or ringing up your children who are miles away, or your parents because they're on their own. I think people sometimes don't want to intrude, but actually this is the time to say, I need some support today, I feel down today, and I'll feel fine tomorrow, and be able to support somebody else tomorrow. So just be kind to yourself.
Wise words, Kate. Thank you so much for coming to join us, Kate. It's been a pleasure to talk to you. For those of you who are quite sharp-eared, yes, you did hear Kate Mosse refer to herself by her own nickname, which is, of course, Moose. You weren't imagining it. She said it. It's now out there in the ether, and we could never get it back again. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you for.
It's a pleasure, Blez.
Thank you for being a supporter of the Lockdown LitFest. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us. Thank you for supporting us. Please do tell your friends. Please do tweet about us. As Kate was saying about what was the Orange Prize for Fiction when it began, it is now the Women's Prize for Fiction. We need your support. We're doing this for you. We're a very small team. We're working 20 hours a day. We're all absolutely exhausted. And if you get some pleasure from this, it's all been worthwhile. So thank you so much, Kate Mosse. Thank you so much indeed. And ladies and gentlemen, as ever, be kind to yourself. Please be well. Take care. And be nice to the people that you love. Thank you for joining us. Cheerio.
Bye.